Hey, this is Zoe from Privacy Not Included, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. Today we have episode 390 for August 19th, 2024. We're getting very close to episode 400, just 10 more to go. Gosh, it's hard to believe it's been 400 episodes. And of course, we'll have Bruce Schneier on the show for that one to celebrate the quad centennial, whatever that would be. So anyway, we've got a great interview for you today. This is one I've been waiting to do for a long time. We actually recorded this probably a couple months ago. I was really backed up with some interviews for a while. I was kind of stacked up. So we're finally catching up on a lot of those. And today we'll be talking with Zoë MacDonald from Mozilla's Privacy Not Included team. You may recall that we talked to Jen Kaltrider a little while back about car privacy and how horrible that was. Well, unfortunately, dating apps are not going to be a whole lot better. They've gotten to be very popular, especially probably with the younger audience, but I think a lot of age groups and demographics are actually using them now. And obviously today we're very concerned about giving away a lot of information to our smartphone apps and what we give them access to. In a lot of cases, we can justify not giving them access. We can say, you don't need to know my location. You don't need to see my contacts. But dating apps, in order to do what they need to do to find your partner, to find someone you're most compatible with, they really kind of need to know some very personal information. So can we trust them? Are some apps better than others in terms of securing your data and guarding your privacy? You'd kind of hope that with applications of this type that they might go the extra mile to put you at ease and try to convince you that they are doing the right things to protect your data. But as I think we're going to find out today, they're just apps like other apps, which means that they're not that good. Real quick before we get into that, I know that there's been a big story. Actually, we covered it when it first broke about like 3 billion records of people from a data broker were stolen that included things like, in the United States at least, have social security numbers, some very personal information. This is a company that you didn't choose. You are not a customer of this company. It's another data broker that got your information from somewhere else, but they were hacked, and these 3 billion records were put up for sale on some dark websites, and now it looks like they're just going to give them away. So we'll talk about it next week, but just real quick, your best defense in situations like this is to freeze your credit at all 3 major credit bureaus, if you're in the U.S. It is now free and pretty easy to do online. I've got a guide for this. I just updated it recently, so look for a link in the show notes for that, which will give you all the details. Also, you're just going to have to be more vigilant. You know, when you get text messages or emails or calls out of the blue, ones that you're not expecting that try to scare you, those are in particular, something very urgent, very scary. Hang up or walk away. Give yourself some time to think about that. Get away from whatever it is that's bothering you, and really think about it. And if you're still worried, try to find some independent way to verify whatever scary thing it was that they told you to make sure it's real. But we'll talk about that more next week. All right, let's get to my wonderful interview on dating apps with Zoë MacDonald. Zoë is a content creator at Mozilla's Privacy Not Included, a buyer's guide and a public resource that reviews connected products for privacy and security. She and her colleagues read privacy policies so that you don't have to. Thank goodness. Zoë, thank you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, we talked with Jen not long ago about car privacy, which was pretty horrendous. And at the time, I know that you guys were working on the dating apps one, and I told her as soon as that comes out, I want to talk to one of you guys. And now is that time. You've released your report on that, and it was not good. It was, as you might expect, but nevertheless, we'll get into that today. So first of all, for someone who's never used an online dating service, or maybe hasn't done it in a while, like, I don't know, myself, where it used to be like a web page thing and now it's an app thing, can you give us a quick overview? Like, how do these things actually work? Like, what do these apps really do? And there's like dozens of apps now. How are they different? Like, what makes one different from another?
There are a lot of dating apps out there.
Yes.
There are probably more than 1,000 different dating apps,
Wow.
but they all basically promise to do the same thing, which is to help you meet the people that you want to meet. And usually they say that in order to do that, you have to provide them with a ton of personal information as possible so that they can find you someone who's truly compatible so that you can look through these matches on your phone or your browser, whatever. So hopefully there's something for everyone out there. And there does appear to be a lot of diversity in the apps, which is kind of cool, kind of exciting. But when you dig into the apps and start looking a little bit at, their FAQs or their web presence, you notice that there actually is a lot of similarity across apps. There's a lot of similarity in the ways that they work. Like I think a lot of the apps used to kind of have their own unique interfaces. Now most of them involve some kind of swiping. Like if you're not familiar with the Tinder interface, it's like you get presented with profiles of people and then you kind of swipe left for no and right for yes. And the reason for that, I think, especially since we last reviewed dating apps in 2021 even, is that a lot of these apps are owned by the same companies. So about half of the apps we looked at are owned by just two companies. Those companies being Match Group, which is probably the biggest dating company in the world that owns at least 40 dating apps that you would know about. Tinder, OkCupid, Match, of course, their namesake app, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, Black People Meet, Our Times, and just dozens more dating apps. Or sorry, Our Time, not Our Times. That's an older adult app. Spark Network is another big dating app company. They own Christian Mingle, JDate, Elite Singles, and Zoosk from the apps that we looked at. And then also Bumble and Badoo are owned by the same company as well. So that kind of explains why there is actually a lot of similarity in the way that these apps work and also in their privacy policies, for better or for worse.
All right, so, but like, how do they work? Like, if you've never used one of these things before, I mean, it's become a meme, the whole swipe left, swipe right. I mean, it's become part of the terminology that we kind of use. But in reality, like, as I'm using these apps and signing up for these apps, how do they function? Like, what do I tell them, and then what do they do for me?
Good question. I mean, what they do for you, a lot of that happens behind the scenes. So we don't know, like when an app tells you that it's working to show you the most compatible matches, we don't always have a good idea of what that algorithm or what that process looks like. But as far as what you do, like when you're signing up for the app, a lot of the intake processes involve answering a lot of very personal questions. And often these processes are long and unskippable, and they might go into some really personal territories like whether your parents are still married or whether you smoke or, of course, where you live or how you feel about certain shapes or how you'd react to slipping on a banana peel. They kind of like from the mundane to the ridiculous, whether it's like a personality quiz or whether it's information that they will then subsequently publish in your profile. It's just the intake process from what I've, observed from dabbling in a number of these different apps is pretty intense as far as like extracting personal information from you.
And they vary in terms of like target demographics. Like obviously some of them are built around sexual preferences, but some of them like JDate and some of these other ones are built around like demographic things like, I'm looking for a Jewish partner. I'm looking for a farmer partner. I know there's a farmer dating app.
We did consider that one, but it wasn't, it didn't make the cut, unfortunately.
So there are some, I guess, that are universal and some that are more targeted, but in a lot of cases, obviously, to find the right match for you, they need to know certain things about you, including, I'm sure, sexual preferences and things that would be very, very personal information. And then supposedly, behind the scenes, they're munging all these things and using some opaque algorithm, some secret sauce to match you up with other people. And then, I guess what? So on a daily basis, they're presenting new people to you. And then if you like someone, do they have to like you back? Like, what are some of the mechanics for how these things work?
First of all, I think that's a really good point, and it's kind of a frustrating thing because a dating app is one of the apps where you're like, that it's a really good reason to provide a bunch of personal information. Like, if you are looking for a compatible partner, of course you have to reveal a lot of information about not just you, but also your lifestyle and preferences and personality, and even upload photos of yourself and current photos. And like, there is a real... It does make sense that, like, the reason that they're collecting this information. I think the piece where it goes off the rails is that they use that information for reasons that are totally unrelated to finding a compatible partner. And we don't really know. I mean, we know what information that they can collect from you as a dating app, which, you know, because of those reasons I mentioned before, is super extensive, but we don't necessarily know for sure how they're using that information and whether that information is always going to be used in your best interest. In fact, most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, you know, 80% of these apps say that they may share or sell your personal information for advertising. They might also leak that information, you know, accidentally, just not take care of it properly, not have adequate security standards. So that worries us.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and, you know, I think a lot of us, you know, understand to some extent that a lot of these apps are collecting information for targeted advertising, but, and we might balk at, you know, giving this information. But I mean, things like your current location, a lot of these apps are looking for people near you. So they want your current location. So they could be tracking that all the time. So location information is really personal information. It's one of the things that allows data brokers to de-anonymize data a lot of times, because your movement patterns are very specific to you. And a lot of times it's pretty easy to correlate that. Now, Apple, and I think Android has done this now too, has some really interesting compromises for sharing your location. It used to be all or nothing, which was great. I mean, even just having the choice of saying, I want to share my location with this app or not, it was kind of nice. They started offering something called only when the app is in use. Like, I'm actually using it right now. It's the frontmost app. So there's that, like Uber. That's a common thing for like an Uber. Like, they don't need to know where you are all the time, but when I'm waiting for my car, they need to know where I'm at. But I think Apple's also starting to do like gross location data, like what city you're in, not what latitude and longitude you're currently at. What do the various apps require in terms of, because they're going to want to know your location to some degree. How do they look in terms of privacy for location data?
So all of the apps that we looked at, but one, and funny enough, eHarmony was the exception, want access to your location. And by location, I mean geolocation. And I understand that in some cases that makes sense for apps that operate based on finding people who are near you. Mm-hmm. But I question whether they really need that data, especially based on how, to your point, how personal and how vulnerable that data is. Because you could also just provide it one time, right? Or you could say like what city and what neighborhood that you live in. So there's a few things about location data that kind of bother me. The fact that they all ask for it, first of all, like I said, your geolocation, when it is so vulnerable, that is a red flag.
And to be clear, you mean like your current location right now, as opposed to where I live. So like, I want to find people near where you live. It's not that. It's where are you currently?
Exactly. And most of these apps want access to this all the time. So they want access in the background to, you know, where you are at all times, basically, through the app on your phone, whether or not the app needs that ever, or whether the app needs that, to your point, when you are using the app. And some of the privacy policy language that I take issue with is when they'll say something like, we only collect your location data with your consent. Many of the apps say this. But what they mean by you giving your consent is that you're choosing to use the app. So your alternative to not providing your location would be not using that app at all. And in case anybody doesn't know, like, you can go into your phone settings and turn off location access, as you should, and anything else that you don't want that app to have full access of. Like, another thing that I would keep my eye on is your photo library. Like, they don't need access to your entire photo library. They can just have access to the 3 dating photos that you've chosen to share. The other thing about location is that many of the privacy policies say that because of how their software works or because of how their interface works, other users may be able to determine your precise location. So they can basically triangulate your location. Grindr's privacy policy warns about this. Scruff's privacy policy warns about this. I think also OkCupid and Bumble had similar vulnerabilities, which they have both, to their credit, patched, but where security researchers said, hey, there's a very simple way, a very simple hack that I can perform to actually get access to anyone on OkCupid or Bumble's precise location. Yeah, that's a huge risk to your safety, of course. Yeah, so anytime you're sharing, giving access to your location, that may be leaked, shared, sold, or may be able to be determined just simply by other users on that platform.
Wow. The other thing these apps must be doing is inferring a lot of information about you, not just what you directly tell them and answer from questions you give, but with your interactions with them, with people that you date and like or don't like, kind of like a Netflix movie recommendation algorithm, except based on people. I mean, I assume that they've got to be taking all this information in, and not just what you told them, but how you interact with the app and interact with other people in that app to eventually build up more information about you. Do we know? Do they say what they do in terms of trying to infer information from you? And then the privacy policies, which thank goodness you've read because they're impossible to digest, says we have quote unquote partners and we may share and for vague purposes. Do we know that are they also working with third parties to get information about you from other sources?
Inferences are such a question mark. It's common for apps and products to say that they can create inferences about their users, but we don't always get a ton of detail about how they create those inferences or why or what they do with those inferences. Unfortunately, 64% of the apps that we looked at in this study did say that they can create inferences about their users. I mean, probably partly, like you said, for the reasons that you mentioned. We don't, like I said, get a full picture of why or what or how and with whom that those inferences are shared. But there were a couple of details that did stand out to me when we were doing our research. So the apps owned by Spark Network, that would be the ones that we studied, Christian Mingle, J8, and Elite Singles, say that they can scan your content using third-party services to help identify your interests and activities. So in other words, scanning your photos for things in the background of your photo, like pets or sports or trips that you went on, to help them, apparently, to help them provide better matches for you. Which seems a bit excessive to me, like a bit unnecessary, because you're already answering so many personal questions. And I think that the information that you want to be matched on should probably be limited to information that you explicitly share and not things that are being inferred about you, that you actually have little to no visibility over. Like, what are these inferences? What are these... And inferences, for anyone who doesn't know, because I feel like it's not a common sense term at all, is just basically assumptions about you based on other data that they already have about you. Oh, and 25% of the apps that we looked at also collect metadata from your content. So information about the photo or the file of the content, whether that's a photo or video, so where it was taken, when and what day, things of that nature. So again, it's not just the information that you explicitly share with the dating app or that you have the intention to be shared, but they also collect more information that you're not even aware that they're collecting. And they also may collect additional information about you from third parties, as you said, or partners.
Just to give people an idea, that I just recently was talking to somebody who was saying that Facebook, I have to take his word for this, but there was a study apparently that Facebook was able to figure out your sexual preferences based on your posts and your friend list more accurately than your friends. Like, if you haven't come out, if you've not personally come out yet. And I also remember another thing that these apps did, because I've used eHarmony back in the day, and I forget if I read this on their literature or a review I found elsewhere, but eHarmony is really big about finding long-term matches, because some of these apps are just for like quick hookups. There's a wide variety of that as well. But eHarmony is one of the ones that supposedly we're here to find you a life partner. Whether you're married with them or not is different. But they had this thing where they had structured their question list to try to weed out people who were adulterers, people that were already married that were on eHarmony because they thought that was a bad thing, which I can understand. But they didn't explicitly ask you that. They actually tried to infer that. They made a point of trying to infer that from the questions they asked. They use psychologists to figure that out. Do you have any other stories like that? Do you know of any other apps that claim to be doing that sort of thing to weed out bad people or that sort of thing?
I mean, that makes sense coming from eHarmony because for most of the apps, I tried to kind of have a look at the intake process as much as I could to see what information is mandatory and what piece of information are voluntary. But if I remember correctly, eHarmony was one of the ones that leaned really heavily on this sort of like personality test intake, where it's not that you're answering questions for your profile or they're going to slot you in something group. It's like they're trying to get a sense of something more intangible, something about yourself that you might not even know, which I think is a bit creepy. OkCupid is another website that has a similar intake process where you answer questions based on compatibility that reveal things about yourself or the inferences to the answers of those questions may reveal things about yourself that you might not know, whereas they do because they have, hundreds and thousands of answers to these questions. But anyway.
This sounds like the Facebook, which cast of Sex and the City are you or whatever, where they ask you some questions to try to get it, angle shot at some part of your personality.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's definitely the impression that I get as well.
All right. So after you evaluated thousands of these apps, how did you determine which ones you were going to rank? Which ones did you pick? How many did you look at?
It's pretty simple. We basically tried to choose the most popular apps, and then we also intentionally chose a cross-section of apps so that we weren't just looking at apps that were targeting the same types of groups of people. We looked at our time, like I said, for older adults. We looked at Grindr, which is like a men seeking men app. Scruff is also a similar app to Grindr. We looked at Lavu, which I think is more popular in Europe, but it's one of the world's most popular dating apps. We looked at Coffee Meets Bagel, which is an interesting app, confusing to read because they use language like you're the coffee or you're the bagel, or it's reading the privacy policy.
They took the pun a little too far.
A little bit. We have to kind of try to figure out how the apps work just to get a sense of it. And this one in particular, I was like, I'm not following because it's like if you pay, you get coffees or bagels. Anyway, but that was sort of a unique one that we looked at. We looked at an app called Zeus, which again, I think is maybe more popular in other parts of the world. Elite Singles is interesting. It's a bit of like a snooty app for people, with earning a certain income, I guess, is the main
qualifier.
General vibe of that one. Yeah. And then of course, we looked at a few really popular apps that target people that have a certain religious background. So, JDate, Muzz, Christian Mingle. We looked at Tantan, which is nicknamed Chinese Tinder, Bumble, which is supposed to be kind of like an alternative app. We also looked at Hinge, which I sort of raised an eyebrow about Hinge because it billed itself as the anti-Tinder, but now it's owned by the same company that owns Tinder. So that definitely raises an eyebrow when Tinder and anti-Tinder are, owned by the same company. We looked at BLK, which is focused on, people of color, Black people. We also looked at Black People Meet similarly. Plenty of Fish. I feel like that's an old school app, but it's still going. They just had a rebrand recently. Tinder, of course. Badoo, I think I mentioned. Her. Happen, which also is, I think, a French-based app. So it actually ended up being a little bit better at privacy and security than some of the other apps we looked at. And the only app that got a thumbs up from us was the one that I mentioned when we were chatting earlier, Lex, which is an app for queer people. I think mostly women seeking women or femme presenting people app.
And were there any that you absolutely just ruled out, like you looked and said, nope, we're not doing that one? And if so, why?
No, not really. We were pretty open-minded. I mean, the biggest criteria that we use, like I said, is just whether or not these apps were popular, because we just want our reviews to be as useful as possible to the greatest number of people as possible. So we would review anything.
All right. Okay. So with that, what were your key takeaways, and what were some of the most concerning findings that you had?
Well, the key takeaway is that dating apps are not very good at privacy and security. And unfortunately, that's not so different from what we found when we first reviewed them in 2021. I would say they're about the same. If anything, they've gotten a little bit worse. But they have a terrible track record of protecting user information. And then, as I mentioned earlier, most of these apps also say they can share or sell your personal information. But yeah, I mean, the fact that they don't secure data and that they will share it is particularly troublesome for this group of apps because they have such a good reason to get such a great volume and diversity and of super personal information about their users. So it's not looking good. Like I was saying earlier, what we try to do with these guides, what we have done in the past is we look at a ton of products and we can kind of divide them into three groups. We can divide them into apps that receive the privacy not included warning label, which means like do not stay away, basically. That's our warning sign. And then apps that are kind of okay for your privacy, read the review, understand what the risk is. And then apps that we can give a thumbs up to where we say, this app is pretty good. It's doing a pretty good job at protecting your privacy. Go for it and download it. And you don't have to worry too much about it. But with the guides that we published recently, we've just noticed that first group of apps that we would traditionally say, stay away from them is growing and growing and growing. So most of the apps that we studied received our privacy not included warning label. So it's not really the case anymore that we can tell people to stay away from products and, apps and services that get that warning label, which is unfortunate because it feels like the status quo is just getting lower and lower.
How many of the apps that were owned by the same company shared the same basic privacy policies? Do they, I assume that what happened is some of these companies started as solo enterprises and then were bought up by Match Group or this other one. I don't know that for a fact, but maybe you can elucidate. But when they come under the umbrella of one of the two big ones, do they inherit the privacy policy of the one, or are they actually different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's true what you said, that Match Group, of course, they develop their own apps, but they do also just acquire apps under like the Match Group umbrella. Usually it's the case that apps that are owned by the same or products that are owned by the same company have very similar privacy policies. It seems to us, like based on reading so many different privacy policies by the same company and brand, that they tend to set one rule for all the products. And then the biggest difference between products would be differences in functionality that would make that, privacy policy different. But sometimes there are kind of random differences, like just for example, Plenty of Fish and BLK are both owned by Match Group, but for some reason they're just a little bit worse than all the other Match Group apps. They both say that they can, most of the Match Group apps that we looked at say that they can share or sell your information or use your information for advertising, but those two apps in particular say that they can sell your personal information for ads.
I assume that's got to be buried deep, right? I mean, is it obvious as you're reading that, like, yes, we will sell your data, or do they put in some real weird, obfuscated legalese?
Nothing is obvious with the privacy policy, right? Because the only thing that they say up front is something like, we really care about your privacy. And there's usually a few paragraphs of that before you can get to any substantial information about what they actually do with your data. But another thing about privacy policies that's come up a lot before is, we often get this question of, well, your research says, or the privacy policy says that they may do X, Y, Z, or they can do X, Y, Z, instead of using like more definitive statements like they do sell, they do share. And that's just because that is kind of the cheeky, sneaky language of a privacy policy. They always, I guess I can't say you'd say always, but in my experience, every privacy policy that I've read is couched in that kind of language, that kind of qualifier. So just because they say may, it doesn't mean that they'll never say we do. So may is sort of their version of, yes, we do this thing.
Well, and I'm sure they're written by lawyers, and I'm sure a lot of it's just CYA, right? They just want to make sure that even if they don't do it now, if they decide to do it later, or if they kind of did it and didn't realize they were doing it, they can say, oh, well, we told you we were doing it, or we might do it. And, oh, look, we did.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
all right.
That's my impression of how these policies are written. Definitely by lawyers and definitely for the purpose of like casting a wide net usually.
So, all right. So, we all like to say if the product is free, then you're probably the product. But there's, unfortunately, the counter is not always true. There's a lot of services we pay good money for, like cell service, where they're still selling your data. And cars. You spend a lot of money on cars. And you'd think that why would they need to sell your data to make money? Well, because it's there. So I'm curious, I remember eHarmony back in the day was pretty expensive. And some of these other services I imagine probably are too, depending on the service. Did you find any correlation between the ones that charge more versus how much they say they're going to sell your data? Or were they ad supported, for example? Like the ones that may be less money, are they ad supported? And then it's more obvious that they may be selling your data for advertising purposes? Was there any correlation between cost and privacy?
Yeah, it's such a good point because I agree with you when I think we've sort of been trained just because of the way that the data economy works. When you're paying for something, you expect more privacy because when you're not paying for something, there's an implicit understanding of like, oh, okay, am I somehow secretly paying for this with my data? Which, by the way, is still not cool, still not okay. We're not necessarily agreeing to giving up that data in any situation. But yeah, with dating apps and a lot of other products, unfortunately, it's not your money or your privacy. It's actually both. So I think to your point about the ads, a lot of the paid versions of the apps offer an ad-free experience, but just because they're not necessarily showing you ads based on information that they've collected about you doesn't mean they're not still sharing or selling your information for other reasons or doing, other things about it. We actually didn't really find in the privacy policies any big differences between privacy-wise, between like paid versions of the app and free versions of the app.
Yeah. That doesn't surprise me, but I was hoping that maybe you could pay for privacy, even though, again, that is not a good thing either. It sets up a privileged view of privacy, which is not good either.
Right.
Okay, so we read about data breaches all the time. We become numb to it, to be honest, because they happen all the time. It's gotten so bad that I basically tell most of my audience, just assume it's going to happen. Assume your data is out there, and so so your best thing you could do is mitigate that and try to be ready for what would come as a result. But when we're talking about breaches for this kind of data, this is extremely personal. In fact, I don't know if the audience remembers, but one of the more famous data breaches was Ashley Madison, which was a service explicitly for people who wanted to cheat on their spouses. It was for adulterers. I forget what their tagline was, but it was pretty gross. Like life is short and please cheat. I forget what it was. It was something like that. So it sounds like I know what you're going to say, but how do the dating apps compare with other companies in terms of cybersecurity practices and data leaks and privacy protection? Do they understand that the data they have is more important and they do better, or are they just like everybody else?
I would also expect apps that collect such intimate information to take extra care to protect it and to treat it with a certain amount of respect that would involve like not sharing or selling it. Unfortunately, that's definitely not the case with dating apps. And I think Ashley Madison is a really good example. And I like what you said earlier in your question about how basically your policy and what you tell your friends is just to assume that your data is going to be leaked. I think that sounds kind of grim, but it's also just a really smart way to to operate. And then having the mindset of like not sharing information that you don't want to be leaked just because you can't be sure. But what I was also going to say about Ashley Madison, why it's such a good example, is because ultimately the privacy policies, the marketing material, what they print on their website about their security and privacy practices, that's all we really have to go on as consumers. And same with us in our research. Like, we have to trust that what they're saying about their privacy and security is true, but we don't necessarily know that it is. We don't really have a good way of checking that. And oftentimes, if that information is going to come out, that there were lies about privacy and security in the way that there were in that massive Ashley Madison breach, people usually only find out about that after it's way too late, after their information has been breached.
Right. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the thing I'm curious about, that this wouldn't have been a thing back when I used eHarmony years ago is a lot of the stuff is through apps now, not just online through web forms. And there's a lot of direct messaging. Like I'm sure there's messaging apps built into a lot of these dating apps. Do any of them claim to have end-to-end encryption? Do they claim that the messages between you and the recipient are messages even they can't read? Is that a feature of any of them? Or should we basically just assume that they are also looking at all of our communications, perhaps to target us with ads or to learn more about us and that sort of thing?
This is a genuinely tricky one because, well, first of all, as another public service announcement, your DMs on these platforms are just not private. They're not private. So don't have conversations on dating apps that you want to stay private or that you absolutely don't want another human to read that is not the person that you are sending the direct message to.
Okay.
But this is a tricky one, like I said, because there is kind of a good reason for that. These apps do have some obligation to moderate the conversations that happen on their platforms. So what we found in their privacy policies is that a lot of these apps say that your chats can be scanned by software, obviously for certain words, to weed out certain behaviors, or maybe to detect like a spam or a bot account or something of that nature. And then you should also know that usually, probably through some kind of reporting process or based on whatever their software scans discover, those messages can also be read by human moderators. So that seems to be kind of the standard that we saw across apps. But in general, no, they're not private.
All right. And again, as you mentioned, in fairness, there are dangers to having direct communications with people in relationship situations. I remember eHarmony was really big on not allowing you to go off their service for direct communications right away. They try to manage it and try to keep you in the system, partially for what they said was, for your own protection in some cases, to keep you from getting scammed or predators or bad people. So, on the one hand, I get that, but in your experience with these apps, do a lot of them, I mean, obviously that's also in their best interest to keep you in there because they want to learn more about you and keep you within the system. And if you're on an app that shows ads, the more you're on the app and not off that app, they can show you more ads and make more money, yada, yada, yada. What was your experience with some of these apps in terms of how clingy, I guess they were? How hard was it to break out of their system to do direct messaging with your person when you get to the point where, I want to date you, let's get off this and get into the real world or whatever?
Yeah, I think it is really hard to tell when the dating app is acting in your best interest versus when they're not, because there have been a rush of romance scams, at least according to the FTC in the past few years. They're kind of like hitting an all-time high, it seems. So there is good reason for these apps to say, don't give out your personal information right away, but at the same time, you do want to be cautious when that app is just trying to keep you in the ecosystem as well. So I guess you kind of have to use your best judgment about when you feel that it's personally safe or you're comfortable enough to share your personal information with somebody else and take the conversation off the app somewhere more private, and when, you're still kind of sussing somebody out.
I also remember that in eHarmony, that they would, I think I've remembered this right, they actually would filter out if you tried to put like email addresses and phone numbers in your DMs, to keep you from going off again. And they say it's to protect you. And when you get to the right point on eHarmony back in the day, I don't know what it is now, you would graduate to the point in the relationship where like, okay, well, you're now free to meet in real life and to take this off the app or whatever. But they were really touchy about that sort of stuff. So I was just curious if things had changed or, what some of the other apps are like today.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me. That does sound a bit paternalistic, but I think that's sort of eHarmony's
it is, yeah.
thing. Yeah. I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that Match Group was sued on Valentine's Day for, and I'm just going to quote, for locking users in a pay-to-play loop that prioritizes corporate profits over its marketing promises and its customers' relationship goals. So there is at least some evidence that has been documented that is now being taken to court about Match Group's interest and actions to pursue that interest that would just keep you on the app as long as possible. I mean, it is worth raising an eyebrow when like you actually meeting someone and getting off the app would be bad for business, since most of these apps do operate on a subscription model. So
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was a question I was going to ask that I didn't throw in the thing. But one of the things I think you mentioned in the article is like eHarmony claims something like, we match people every 14 minutes, or we make a new match every 14 minutes, like a long match, like not just here's a person, but like these people become a pair. And but their minimum subscription was like 6 months. So
right.
if I get in there a week and I find my soulmate, do I get a refund? Could I get a prorated, or do I have to keep getting matches for 6 months? What are the subscription models like on these? And do they have an eject button where when you find that person, you could quit early?
Well, here's what I'll say is that eHarmony was also accused of manipulative selling practices and for laying a subscription trap for users, like basically luring users into a situation where they would either have to start or renew their membership. So I think or their subscription, their paid subscription. I think it's fair to assume that dating apps, just like every other app and company and social media platform, have ways of keeping you on the app. And unfortunately, that is in contrast with you finding a match, which is the reason that, you download these apps in the first place.
Yeah, I think I did remember there was a way to like pause your subscription or something, but yeah, I'm sure they're probably all different, and they probably change every year anyway.
Exactly.
Their policies. All right. So the other thing, I'm just going to guess, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that all these services are probably clamoring to add AI to their products and their features, probably everywhere they can, because that is such a buzzword today. So what sort of AI features are these services touting? And do we know, based on the privacy policies that you've read, do they process your AI? Like a lot of AI processing is done in the cloud just because it's intensive. It takes intensive computer effort, which your phone may or may not be able to handle. Do they do a lot of this processing in the cloud? And are they therefore sharing that data either with third parties or potentially even using the data you give them to train their AI models? That's another kind of a thing that's been going on a lot. So what is the story with AI on these systems?
You are correct that a lot of these apps seem to be falling over themselves to integrate AI, I guess just because it sounds good in their marketing materials, maybe. I have seen some, like in our research, we stumbled across some uses of AI that I think could potentially be good and are maybe a good fit for AI. Like Bumble has a new feature using AI called Deception Detector, which is supposed to help find like bot profiles and obviously help them clean up the platform from fake users and bots and things like that. So that's cool. And then we also saw that I think it was Tinder that had AI that wasn't too worrying from a privacy perspective, because apparently all the processing, to your point, was happening locally, but it was about giving Tinder access to your photo library, and they would make a recommendation about what the like cutest or best profile picture would be. I would still be a bit cautious about giving Tinder my whole access to my entire photo library, but at least according to the documentation, like in their privacy policy, it looked okay from a privacy perspective if we trust, that they're doing what they say. But yeah, I think what worries us about AI is that we have the same questions that you have about like how your information is used. Is it used for training? Does that mean that your information is being like uploaded to their servers because they have to, like, depending on what the feature is, it may require that. And then once the information is there, do they delete it? Do they share it? Do they keep it? How do they process it? We don't often get the answers to those questions. What we do know is that two of the companies that we're the most concerned about, who got some of the worst like privacy and security grades, which is Match Group. And so remember, that's like Tinder, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, all those apps, and Grindr have both expressed their intention to integrate more AI into their apps. So that worries us just because they don't have a very good track record, either of those companies, at protecting user data. And we don't necessarily trust that they're going to be super transparent about how they're using that data either.
Lovely. Yeah, though, again, not surprising. Have there been any major breaches within these companies that have hit the news? I can't recall any off the top of my head, which is why I'm asking. Have there been documented cases where these guys have been hacked?
Well, I know that you had on your show recently someone who was speaking about location and sexual health data from Grindr being sold.
Yeah, outing that priest, yeah.
Yeah, that is awful.
That was a data sale. That was a data sale thing, I would think. I think the way that worked was it wasn't that Grindr was hacked. It was that Grindr was collecting the location information, or maybe there was some software SDK in their app that was doing it behind the scenes, and that data was then sold on the third-party market, and that is where these people got that information. I don't think that was actually directly hacked, but yes, that is an app. Regardless, that is still a bad thing that happens, and that's the fact that this data exists is going to cause problems like that. But I'm curious if you know of any. I don't, other than Ashley Madison, I don't know of any of these services, or I can't remember any stories of these services actually being directly hacked for data, or there was some other breach. I was just curious if you knew of any.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're looking at companies' track records, we actually keep it pretty conservative. So we only look at data breaches and hacks that happen in the past 3 years. And even with that pretty narrow window of 3 years, half of the apps that we looked at had suffered from a pretty major data breach, leak, or hack.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty bad. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you were talking about AI potentially being used to catch deception. And one of the kind of hot buzzword terms lately has been pig butchering, which is this notion of somehow developing an online only relationship with someone and pretending to be someone you're not, getting someone to be romantically involved, and then slowly over time draining them of their funds in one form or another, getting them to send you money for whatever reason or giving access to your accounts. And anyway, so they call it pig butchering. You're fattening up this pig and then you butcher the pig. That's the general idea of the thing. I would have to think these apps would be a prime place for predators like that to prowl. What is the situation with scams on dating apps, and how prevalent is that? And how can we protect ourselves if we're trying to use these apps? And are the companies themselves doing a good enough job at weeding people out?
It definitely seems like romance scams are very common, on the rise. In our research about the background of these apps and their appearance in the news, it seemed like the larger apps are, apps with more users are bigger targets for romance scammers, but that's probably just because of the sake of efficiency that romance scammers go where, they think that most of the people are. How to avoid romance scams is not my area of expertise, but I will say that I don't think that these apps have done a good enough job at removing like spam or fake or, scammer profiles in the past. It seems like now that this issue is kind of on everybody's radar, they are doing a little bit better. Like a lot of the apps themselves have like little safety guides and warnings and things like that, either inside the app or linked on their website. So it's worth giving those a read to see how you can avoid meeting those people.
Okay. All right. So if after everything we've said today, I still want to try a dating app, let's say, someone in the audience, what are your suggestions for maximizing your privacy and limiting the amount of data that can be collected and shared? For instance, I'm curious, can I hide or obfuscate my identity? Do I have to use my real name? How many of these apps actually go through the process of upload a driver's licenses or a passport or something so you can prove it's really you? Can I be sort of anonymous on these apps? Is that even possible?
Mostly it's not possible, but you can definitely choose to share a little bit less. Like, I think you can dial it back and definitely question all of the pieces of information that the app or that the website is asking from you. One thing that I would tell people to do is if there's information that you don't really want to share, definitely check if you can just skip that question, or check if there is a response that says something like prefer not to say. Don't feel obligated to fill in every form, even though they are definitely going to be pressuring you to do that thing. There are 2 apps we looked at that do let you have an alias, which is Muzz and Her, which is pretty cool. But aside from that, I think the problem with using an alias or hiding elements of your identity in this context is that it might defeat your goal of finding someone and, being known to other people that you want to date. So I can't fully recommend that, but I think that you can be discreet about what you share. So just share less across the board. I also like what you said earlier. I think that's a really good point. Like, pretend that anything that you're sharing is going to be breached. Like, if this was published and your boss was reading it, like, how okay with that would you be? Like, just share information with the understanding and the expectation that that information can be made public. So something that we've been telling people is like, treat your dating profile a little bit more like your LinkedIn profile, which is kind of sad. But,
yeah, right.
But, you can share more when you meet someone and you know that you can trust them. And anyway, so just share less is like the main headline. The other thing I would suggest doing is kind of lock down what you do share. So don't connect your dating app to other apps that you have.
Yes.
Like, they'll also prompt you to share your Instagram, or maybe like integrate your Snapchat or even your Spotify.
Oh boy.
I would just avoid having apps talk to each other, because it just gives them an opportunity to exchange information about you. And then you have to trust potentially that other app with even more vulnerable information. So just better not to do that. Also, the same thing along those lines, don't log into your account with a third-party account for exactly the same reason. Yeah. Like, don't log in with Google, just like start a fresh account, even though it's, a couple more steps. And anyway, that's what I would recommend. And then, as we talked about earlier, I think one of the best things that you can do is try to limit app permissions where possible from your actual device settings. So just shut off that tab, because those are things that they may be collecting from you that you're not fully aware of. So it's easier if you just say, no, you can't have access to my location. No, you can't have access to my entire photo library, things like that. Just the less you share, the better. But you want to share enough to find someone that you like. So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is the hard thing with these apps. And I've even heard some people say, like, don't use any stock photos of yourself. Like, let's say you've got a common headshot that you use for a lot of things because it's a good picture of you, and that's why you use it. Don't use that, because then through simple reverse image searches, I can find your social media accounts or wherever else you've used that picture. Now, I know that facial recognition is making some of this worthless anyway. If it's a picture of your face, then they're going to find pictures of your face. But it just makes it that much easier if you're reusing a photo that you've used your profile pictures for other services, because then people can find you.
That's a good point.
Can you use these apps on the web only? How many of them require you to install a smartphone app? And then when I'm done, can you delete your data pretty easily?
That's a good question. It can be a bit safer to use apps from the browser if you can. We didn't look into that in detail, just because then you're not giving it access to like your phone data.
Yeah.
So that if that is an option, we can definitely recommend that people do that. What was the other part of your question? Oh, can you delete your data? Oh, I wish you could.
Really?
You really should be able to, because it's your data. But something that people should know is, like, just deleting your profile or deleting your account or even deleting the data that you see in your profile doesn't necessarily mean that the company is going to delete that data. And a pretty small number of companies give users the right to delete their data. It is something that I suggest that people try to do when you're finished with an app, like request that they delete it.
I remember I went back, actually, when things started getting bad with data breaches, I actually went back. I hadn't used eHarmony since a long time back, but I went through whatever their process was for actually deleting my account and my data, which was involved, like most of them are. It's not just a click of a button. Yeah, I probably had to send them something, but...
They do make it so difficult. I went through the same I asked a friend to go through the process, actually, to not even delete her data, but I was wondering, like, she had used one of these apps like more recently than I had, and I was wondering if she could actually download her data. And the hoops that they made her go through to try to confirm that it was her account, it was actually prohibitive. Like, she could not get them to verify that it was her. And of course she has everything because it is her account. Like,
all right, so how hard is it to delete your data with these apps?
It's definitely worth requesting when you're finished with an app to have your data deleted if they do have a process like that online. But usually they don't do that unless they legally have to, unfortunately. Only 5 of the apps that we researched say that they will delete your data if you ask them to, unfortunately.
And the other ones say they won't or can't? Like,
They just don't say that all users have that right. So they may afford that right to you, for example, if you live in California where it's
sure.
the law and
Yeah.
they have to delete your data. But if it's not the law, then they'll say something like, you may have the right to have your data deleted.
It's one of those situations. Yeah. If you happen to live in a jurisdiction like the EU under GDPR or California where there are laws that say you can do it, then yes, of course you can do it. And if you're not,
Yeah. If not, then good luck. Yeah. I mean, sometimes they do funny things, like they'll let you go through the process and then until you get to like where you live. And then it's kind of like, okay, bye, forget it.
I've seen that too. That is horrible. All right. Yeah. Okay. Here's one last question. It's a little bit of a wild card. And I understand if you guys don't know this, but did you, at the end of the day, how good are these apps at actually finding? I mean, the whole point of this is to find a mate, right? So, and I'm going to talk about hookup apps. I'm sure those work just fine. But in terms of finding, a partner, a long-term relationship, are there any studies as the effectiveness of this versus good old-fashioned trolling bars or, whatever the old school ways of finding people are or socializing in public? Do we have any information on that? And does it vary by demographic? I don't know.
Great question. And I think it's really worth asking yourself, what am I getting out of this app or service, especially when you feel like there's a risk of your privacy, like just weighing the risk of whether or not you think you're going to be satisfied with the outcome. And would you still be happy, giving away this kind of information if you're not going to meet the love of your life? So this isn't a question that we could really study in detail. I do think it's fair to question these apps' motivation and whether they have your best interest at heart and whether that aligns with their bottom line. And like I said, just a reminder that Match Group is currently being sued for locking users in basically an endless subscription loop that goes against their users' like genuine desire to meet somebody. So, I mean, aside from all that, like through the course of our research, looking at their track records, looking at their appearance in the news, I can say that I get the sense that users are not super happy with the state of dating apps right now. It seems like there are a lot of complaints about how they're working. So worth considering that as a data point about, like I said, whether you're going to get what you want from the app. But I wouldn't know what else to recommend. So I also can't say in good conscience to stay away from dating apps or something like that. Ultimately, I just hope that these companies try to step up and do better and respect their users' privacy, or that, globally we can have stronger privacy laws to force them to do that.
Amen. All right. Well, Zoe, thanks for coming on the show. This is a very, very interesting topic. And I think that a lot of our audience will be interested to hear, even if they're not currently dating. I think it's important to understand because it's such a thing these days, and to understand what's going on with these. So thank you so much for doing the research. Thank you for reading all those privacy policies so we don't have to. And it was great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
All right, that'll do it this week. Big thanks to Zoe for coming on the show. That was a lot of fun. It was depressing, but it was a good topic, and I'm really glad we had a chance to cover it. I've been wanting to talk about that for a long time now and get you that information. I'm single. That's right, ladies. He's single. And I've thought about doing this, and I've been, now that I'm in the privacy space, and this is a focus of mine, it's something that I personally have been very, very worried about. And so I figured I couldn't be the only one. And so I was really glad to at least get the straight dope on many of these apps. And honestly, I'm not super surprised. I'm disappointed, but not surprised. So one little geeky thing I wanted to kind of bring up as far as explanation goes, I saw the articles that she was referring to about dating apps being used to pinpoint people. And there was one recently, actually, that I considered for doing on the show. And I think I had to skip it for time. But it talked about this, and I learned a term that I had not known before. When you do this sort of three-way pinpointing of something based on distance, it's called trilateration, not triangulation, trilateration. And I think from reading these articles, basically the way it worked is some of these apps had a built-in radius built in. Like, I want to meet people within a certain, radius of distance. Like I'm willing to date people within 1 kilometer, or I'm willing... tonight I'm looking for somebody to hook up with within 60 meters of me or whatever. But if there's some distance involved, the app would kind of say, yes, here are the people in that distance, or no. But if you had that data, if you knew what the radius was, you could like move away from that person until they went out of range. And then you'd know, okay, from where I'm at right now, they are that far away from me because they say that is the range of this app. That's the radius that I'm looking for. Now go back into the circle so they're back in range and then go a different way. And then as soon as you go far enough that person is out of range again, draw a circle on the map with that radius and do that one more time in a different direction. If you do that in 3 different directions, where those 3 circles intersect is where that person is. That's kind of the way GPS works, actually. So anyway, that's a little bit of a geeky sidebar there. But in general, I would just like to say, make sure that not just dating apps, but you really go through all the apps on your smartphone and review all the permissions that you have given to them. Make sure that they really deserve and need to have the level of access that you've given them. When it comes to location, if you can, give them a fuzzy distance or no distance, or maybe only when they're the frontmost app. Some other permissions you definitely should look at are things like access to your contacts or access to your photos. Those could be very, very revealing. And just take the time to review those things and limit what you've given access to. So for the patrons, you're going to get some bonus content, some bonus Q&A with my guest as usual. That will come out Thursday morning. And a couple other questions I had for Zoe involved other things I know they have studied in the past, including the privacy concerns for smart sex toys and also AI romantic chatbots. That's a thing. So anyway, patrons, you'll get a little bit of bonus content around those topics on Thursday morning. I just got done interviewing Proton's CEO, Andy Yen. I think this may be his 5th time on the show, and they released a lot of products this summer. Proton Docs, Proton Scribe, Proton Wallet, and they also restructured their business into a new kind of interesting foundation. So I had a lot of questions for Andy about those things, and I've got some other great ones in the pipeline. So if you haven't subscribed, now would be a great time to do that so you won't miss anything. All right, take care, everybody. Stay safe out there, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge.